But I came on right after the court-ordered desegregation, but it hadn't been done. And so we we met every single night. I was the first woman president of school, but we met every single day and night, and Wilhelmina Delco was on the board, and that's how we became such fast friends. And then she left me there. She went on to run for state rep, and I still remember when she's running for state rep, and she had these crazy opponents. And one of them was asking in a thing, "What do you think about single-member districts?" He said, "I think married people ought to be able to run too." I said, "Mina, you got to be kidding me." She'd come tell us. She was running while we were on the school board. She'd come tell us these. When Exalted had a terrible accident, I tried to get her kids just to move in with me, But I came on with Will Davis was president of the school board. He's a great guy. He's very up in years now. He's not doing real well health-wise. But Will Davis was on the board. Wilhelmina. But Wilhelmina and I became fast friends from that day forward. And no matter what I ran for or as, she was always supporting me. and I ran for the school board here in the city of Austin. When there were a lot of people doing what I guess was white flight, they were going to Westlake Hills or other places that unfortunately had gotten incorporated. And the Austin Independent School District was bigger than the city of Austin then. Now you've got several other districts winging in the city of Austin, but it was larger than the city of Austin. And at the time I ran, we had just been put under court-ordered desegregation. I think it was 1971 when that happened. I ran in the spring of '72, so it was just very fresh. The schools had not been integrated and desegregated and integrated, and so our goal was peaceful integration. I ran at the same time, Gus Garcia ran at that time, and I think maybe Pat Cato was the other one. I'm trying to think who the third. I think there were three of us that ran them, but we all of us who ran, I know I did and Gustavo did, we had anti-busing opponents. Well, now the anti-busing opponents, more truthfully, might have been called desegregation opponents, but anti-busing was a better name to put on it. There was a cover from, it wasn't New Yorker, I think it's New York Magazine. There was a New York Magazine, I don't know if there still is or not. It wasn't the New York Magazine. There was a cover that came out about that time, and boy, I just snatched it up, took it to some place, and that was before days of computers and everything, got it blown up into poster size, and I took it with me everywhere we went for political forums when I was running for the school board that spring. And it had on the cover of this magazine, and I've got it somewhere in storage, I tried to dig it out, but it has a little boy that looked kind of like my kids did at that age. My kids were very young when I ran for the school board. They were like 3 to 6 or 7 years. That's right. All four. They had twins in the middle, so all four of them within 4 years of each other. Scott was very young because Wilhelmina loves to tell one of the stories that he told. But the poster has this little boy on the front that's in a white beret and a little suit and holding a briefcase and very cleaned up, and has a capsule over him. And you can see him through the capsule with his briefcase and his little uniform. And then behind him is a chain link fence, which is very much like the chain link fence at Baker, Baker we made into one of the first 6th grade centers when we bused to the center, and I can talk about that in a few minutes too. My kids were the first in the bus, but and it had chain link fence, and they had these little kids behind them, 3 or 4 little boys behind them, in shorts and t-shirts, and obviously of different ethnic background. There was African American, Hispanic, Anglo kid, and they were climbing the schoolyard fence having fun, and this little kid with the capsule over him is standing in front of the fence. And the title on the New Yorker magazine is just grand. It says, "Some thoughtful parents care enough about their kids' education to send them to public schools." And I have never, ever forgotten that. And I used that as my show and tell everywhere I went, because I was also trying to stop anyone who says, "Hey, don't leave. We've got the best school district. You don't need to go anywhere else. You need to stay here." I was trying to go at any of the white flight and the anti-busing. And while nobody was excited about busing, I mean, nobody wants to put little kids on the bus, but But we were all committed. We had a wonderful school board that was totally committed to peaceful integration of the schools in the city of Austin, and we did it here in the capital city. And I said, you know, if we can do it here in Old River City, it can be a great role model for elsewhere. Now we can talk about some of those interesting things that have happened since that have detracted. But two things I was going to mention. One is talking about introductions when I was running for mayor. Charles Miles, that was one of my favorite ones from in the White Swan Bar. And then the other one was Reverend Relaford, who was at the small Baptist church here in East Austin, right off of Chicon. And he is deceased now. But he was, the Baptist ministers, African American ministers, had a ministers group that met then. And he said, you know, have you met with them? I said, no, I'd love to. And he said, well, come over to my church because it's my time. I'm hosting them at my church. And I'll never forget because his wife was a wonderful cook and she fixed the best fried chicken and biscuits and everything else. But I spoke to him in his sanctuary, and then afterwards we all had lunch. But he introduced me, and it was probably the briefest introduction I've ever had, and I've never had a better introduction than that. And when he introduced me, he said, you may know Carole Keeton McClellan was my name then. He said, you may know Carole Keeton McClellan from school board. And all he said, but I just want to tell you one thing, and introduce her to you. He said, she is a mother hen who scratches for all the chicks in the yard. And I have never, to this day, I mean, I have never had something that means more to me than for him to say that. And I always thought, you know, there are a lot of kids who are going to get it, but you got to really work for those who are not going to get it. I started out public school teacher. Back then I taught civics. Now it's American government, Texas government. And it was a required course, and it still is. And I would have from some kids who had been tagged barely educable, but many of them were very educable. They'd just been tagged that, to national merit scholars in one classroom. So you had to work with a lot of diversity. What I'm proudest of, though, is our peaceful integration of the schools in Austin. And we did, our first step was we bused to the middle. There were those that were busing across town, and we bused to the middle, and we started with fifth graders going into sixth grade. We set up sixth grade centers were the first thing we did, and then we worked our way down through the grades. But we started with sixth grade centers. And my sixth grader was the first one on the bus when we did that. I mean, mine were always, my boys went to Baker. They paired Cassis Elementary, which was in Old West Austin where I lived, with Ortega, which is East Austin. Ortega had, and this is why I got personal examples of why, and I think the one person or examples are why integration works. And that we were paired with Ortega. And when Mark hit sixth grade, and I remember they got up, it was still dark in the morning when you'd stand out for the bus, because it was, you know, it's dark at that hour in the morning. That's all right. I sat there and watched them go on the bus. And, or he didn't know I was watching him. But anyway, but they stuck their heads when I come to school. Oh, don't act like you know me, Mom. But anyway, the Ortega had a lot of the housing project students went to Ortega, and the low-income housing projects, and neat people. They just were economically, you know, not a low-income economic group, but there was and I just cannot tell you all the good things that came from putting those kids together. But one is Renoir, who now calls himself Herman, in latter life started calling himself Herman Hill. Renoir lived in the housing projects, went to Ortega, and he and Scott, and I'm tracking down to Scott now from Mark. I'll tell you, Mark has a funnier story than that, but when Scott got there, that's Renoir was his good friend who went to Ortega, and he said, I want to bring this kid home from school with me, Mom. Is that fine? I said, sure, fine. And he said, well, he lives across town. He can't. I said, I'll take him home. You know, it's all right. You bring him home with you. He brought him home on the bus a lot of times. And then I would take him home after they spent the afternoon together. And I met his mother and all that stuff, and she was great. Anyway, those two were in each other's weddings. decades later, and Scott didn't get married till he was almost 40. I mean, he really was decades later. And he was working for he was with the president. He was press secretary, as a matter of fact, when he got married. But Herman Hill was in Scott's wedding, and Scott was in Herman Hill's. Well, Herman had gotten married before that, and Herman he was high up in corporation in Plano area, and Scott was in D.C. But no matter where they are, Scott's now in Seattle. He's vice president of communications, Seattle University. Wherever they are, I mean, lifetime friendships are made there. Never should math, science, English, social studies. I taught the social studies arena. Never should tracking. You can't track a kid. You cannot have low expectations for our children who can do everything. What has apparently happened, I haven't done the deep research that some of those like at A&M and College Station have done, but you cannot take the first generation where we desegregated and integrated the schools, and then by tracking, if you've got segregated classes that you're tracking, you're undermining the entire reason that we integrated the schools. So every school district should examine very carefully any tracking, so-called tracking programs that are still going on, because you can mix. I know it. I told them you can take children in civics or anything else, and you can have a National Merit Scholar sitting next to a student that hadn't had the opportunities maybe that National Merit Scholar, or one who's going to be ended up getting a National Merit Scholar, has had, and they can learn so much from one another. But you cannot track kids at any age. I can remember a good friend of mine who the teacher said in junior high, she's not college material. She went on to be a pediatric blood specialist. I mean, you cannot track kids. You cannot do that. And I know, as I said, I think of all the things I've done in all my public service, I cannot think of anything more important than peacefully integrating the school district and Austin Independent School District. We cannot resegregate in any shape, form, or fashion by saying these students can't do this work. But the whole purpose is to maximize each individual child's potential. And that's why I get so outraged. You cannot compare this school district to that to a school district, or this school to that school, and you cannot reward teachers on the basis of what kind of scores their kids are making on standardized tests that are fixed for kids who've had certain experiences. I get outraged with how we judge what a good teacher is. A good teacher to me is one who can take those students wherever they are. At the end of the year, they have maximized the individual abilities of every one of those students. And you can't generalize about that, and you can't track them into, you can say, and given the opportunity, you can take a kid that maybe, and I understand that not everyone's going to go to college. I had a program called Texas Next Step, where I wanted every Texas high school graduate to be able to go on to 2 years community college with the state picking up the tab for tuition fees and books, every high school graduate. Because if they get in community college for 6 months, they're never going to be on welfare. I got it passed in the Senate twice. Our governor got it killed on the House floor both times. I still would love to see that happen. Massachusetts picked it up and did it. It would have cost $150 million out of then $140 billion budget. For $150 million, we could have done that. That was some years back. You could still do it. But K through 14 ought to be the norm, because it's K through 16 and beyond now. But all these kids need that opportunity. And so I really get concerned when we're tracking students, say, no, this kid is not college bound. This kid, and if you track them, they're going to have lower expectations. Kids have so much to learn these days, and you can do rote stuff for testing, but testing and tests, they can be one measure. They ought to be used as a measure to help that student. You know where they are and where they need to be. They ought to be used as a measure to help that student. And one thing that you can look at, but teachers should not be evaluated solely on how many kids are passing whatever the test is they're calling it now. It's changed names, changed stuff. And you cannot compare, say, this is a good school district, this is a bad school district, or this is a good school and that is a bad school based on only test scores. Look at the demographics of the kids in that classroom and in that school, and the economics and what opportunities they've had before and after. What ought to be judged is how, if that teacher is, those children are progressing under that teacher and making good progress. It's a great teacher. I can find you some great teachers in tough situations, and what you're going to have is, and this is truly what I fear happens many times. You don't have your good teachers teaching where they need to be teaching the most. They're teaching the scrape off the top gravy classes, and you need your very best teachers teaching those that can learn, but they're not. They all start at different places. I used to joke about the fact that kids come to school with 6 years of adult education behind them. And, sometimes it's on the streets, sometimes it's in the home. But these kids they can be so bright. Teachers should not be evaluated on test scores, and students should not be evaluated totally on test scores. That's one instrument to use, and it's gotten totally out of whack. And we spend tens of thousands of dollars, I mean the millions of dollars. I used to have that figure right in my head. The millions of dollars that we spend on testing and teaching for tests. If you could use those dollars and lower that student-teacher ratio in the classroom and let teachers teach and children learn, instead of being dead last as we are in this state with of adults over 25, we are dead last in these United States in the percentage of those who have a high school diploma or less. I mean, we're dead last. Or you might say we're number one, but we're dead last. And yet, we have probably the 7th largest economy in the world. You compare our gross state product with other nations' gross national product. And yet, we're dead last with children with health insurance, and we're dead last. I'm talking percentage of children with health insurance and adults with insurance, and dead last with adults over 25 who have that have only a high school diploma or less. We're number one, in other words, in all the states of those who only have a high school diploma or less of people over 25. That's unconscionable for a great state like Texas. To lift Texas, we've got to lift all Texans, and it's education, education, education.